The shortcut. Ethan woke up late. His alarm clock had betrayed him, the red numbers glaring at him, already well into the morning. Panic shot through him, knowing he couldn't afford another tardy. The usual route to school was out of the question now. The word detention echoed in his mind, but worse was the thought of his parents' disappointment, their heavy sighs. No, he had to take the shortcut through the woods. The woods. He'd always avoided them, opting for the safer route along the road. Everyone said the shortcut cut the time in half, but the woods were strange, full of stories and rumors that always seemed to stick with him. Today, though, desperation won out. He barely remembered to grab his backpack as he dashed out the door, heart pounding, shoes untied. The trees loomed ahead like a dark barricade, a twisting line of shadows that seemed to breathe. The air carried a damp, earthy scent, mixed with something almost metallic, as if the woods themselves exhaled a warning. Somewhere, a faint rustling could be heard, like whispered secrets just out of reach, adding to the sense that the forest was alive, aware of his intrusion. He hesitated, his instincts prickling at him, whispering to just turn around, take the longer route and deal with the consequences. But time was slipping, and so he forced himself forward, stepping into the shadow. The silence hit him first. The chirping birds and buzzing insects that he had expected at the edge of the woods seemed to vanish the deeper he went. It was like stepping into a vacuum. He could hear his own breathing, every footstep crunching the dried leaves beneath his feet, but the sound was hollow, and each step seemed swallowed up before it could properly echo. The path itself was narrow and winding. Roots snaked across like skeletal fingers, grabbing at his shoes. A chill crept over him. The deeper he walked, the darker the woods grew, the canopy above twisting like gnarled fingers intertwining, blocking out the light. Minutes felt like hours. He checked his watch, frowning. He should have reached the other side by now. A tightening in his chest, a deep instinctual warning, urged him to turn back. The air felt stagnant here, as if it hadn't moved in years, heavy with the odor of decay. Something about the ground seemed wrong, too dark, too wet, slick between the roots, like oil, like it was trying to drink the light around it. A trickle of unease became a steady flood, his eyes darting, trying to pierce the thick shadows. His breath was getting louder in his ears, but it seemed to have no echo, as if the air was too dense, too oppressive to allow it. And then, a crack behind him. He turned so quickly he almost stumbled, his eyes darting through the thick shadows. Nothing. But he knew something had made that noise, something had shifted. He tried to rationalize it, an animal maybe, but his gut told him otherwise. He could feel something, an awareness, like the woods themselves were holding their breath, waiting. The smell was growing thicker, a mix of rot and something metallic, clawing at his senses. His feet felt heavy, his steps dragging as he pressed on, a deep itch of fear crawling beneath his skin. He could swear the trees were closer now, the path narrowing, their skeletal branches reaching out. He felt a deep unease, a gnawing fear that the forest was alive, conspiring to trap him. It was as if the woods themselves were closing in, and he was running out of time. He glanced to the side, certain he'd seen movement, but there was nothing, just the dark tangle of the forest. The ground beneath his feet felt like it was shifting, like something just beneath the surface was writhing, squirming, trying to break free. His pulse was a drumbeat, loud in his ears, drowning out his thoughts. He sped up, his footsteps becoming frantic, and that's when he heard it. Footsteps, behind him, keeping pace, mirroring his own. He stopped. They stopped. His heart caught in his throat. He turned, slowly, every muscle screaming to run, and there, barely visible through the shadows, was a figure. Its face, no, it had no face, just a smear of something dark, as if the features had been scrubbed away. Ethan's breath hitched, fear coiling tight, his body frozen. The figure stood unnaturally still, its proportions off, limbs too long, head tilted as if it were examining him. It felt wrong, as if it shouldn't exist, as if the forest itself had spat it out. Without thinking, Ethan ran. The path twisted underfoot, the leaves and dirt slipping, his breath tearing out of him in ragged gasps. He could hear it behind him, that heavy, deliberate tread, each step matching his. It wasn't rushing, it didn't need to. The ground seemed to shift beneath him, the trees warping, the air thickening. The trunks looked swollen, bulging grotesquely, oozing something dark and viscous that smelled like rot. He caught glimpses of movement, things wriggling out of the trees, pale and glistening, their bodies covered in too many legs, mandibles clicking hungrily. They moved towards him, and he choked back a scream, pushing himself faster. The stench was overwhelming, thick and nauseating. He stumbled, his knees hitting the soft earth, his hands sinking into something wet. He looked down and bile rose in his throat, bones, small and shattered, some with dark, dried flesh still clinging to them. His hands touched something soft, something that gave under his weight, and he realized it was flesh, rotting, decaying flesh. He scrambled back to his feet, but before he could move, something latched onto his arm. A hand, no, not a hand. Long, thin fingers, cold and damp, with sharp nails that dug into his skin. He screamed, the sound ripping out of him, his vision blurring with tears. The figure was there, towering over him, its face still that smear of darkness. Its breath was cold, rancid, washing over his face. Ethan struggled, but it was like his body was shutting down, his limbs heavy, his mind fogging. He felt something sharp, cold, pressing into his skin. He looked down. A blade, rusted, jagged, cutting into his arm. He heard a sickening crunch as it broke the skin, a wet squelch that echoed in the silence. The cold steel sent a shockwave through his nerves, the sensation both sharp and agonizingly slow, like fire spreading under his skin. He felt every inch of it, the skin splitting, blood pouring out, hot and thick, staining the dark earth beneath him. Pain screamed through him, blinding, his voice raw from screaming. The figure moved with deliberate precision, peeling back the skin, exposing raw, twitching muscle. His body convulsed, the pain too much, black spots dancing in his vision, the world fading, spinning. He could see his own bones, white and glistening, his flesh curling back, and he thought he saw it smile, its face shifting, teeth appearing, too many of them, sharp and glistening with his blood. Everything was fading, slipping away, the pain receding into a numbness, his body going limp, darkness closing in. And then... nothing. The bell rang, sharp, jarring. Ethan's eyes flew open, his heart pounding, his body trembling. He was on the football field, the sun blinding, the laughter of students echoing around him. He sat up, his breath shaky, his limbs numb. He looked down, his skin was intact, his body whole, no blood, no pain. But the memory of it, the feeling of his flesh being peeled away, was so vivid, so real. He touched his arm, half expecting to feel the torn skin, the exposed bone, but it was just his arm, unmarked. He looked towards the woods, the shadows dark between the trees. And there, he saw it. The figure, standing just at the edge, its face still that twisted smear, watching him. Ethan shivered, dread settling deep in his bones. He got to his feet, his legs weak, barely able to support him. Everything seemed off, like he was seeing the world through a filter, the colors too bright, the laughter too sharp, grating against his ears. He started walking, his head down, trying to ignore the feeling that he was still being watched. He glanced at his classmates, their faces seemed wrong, their smiles too wide, their eyes too bright, like they were painted on. The laughter sounded hollow, like it was coming from a recording, echoing off walls that weren't really there. He could feel the weight of the figure's gaze on him, heavy, unrelenting. He turned, just for a second, and there it was, standing among the trees, its head tilted, that same grin stretching across its featureless face. He moved faster, his breath coming in short bursts, his hands trembling. He could feel it, the woods pulling at him, calling to him. He could still feel the dirt under his nails, the wetness of the earth, the bones beneath his fingers. The memory clung to him, sticky and inescapable, the pain, the fear. It was real. It had to be real. He slipped into the bathroom, splashing water onto his face, the cold shock barely enough to pull him from the haze. He looked at his reflection, his face was pale, his eyes wide, dark circles etched beneath them. He looked behind him, half expecting to see the figure, but there was nothing. Just the empty stalls, the flickering light casting strange shadows. He let out a shaky breath, trying to calm his racing heart. But the feeling wouldn't leave him, the feeling that he wasn't alone, that something was there, just out of sight, waiting. He stepped out of the bathroom, the hallway empty now, the bell having rung while he was trying to pull himself together. His footsteps echoed as he walked, the sound hollow, the world seeming to stretch around him. The lockers on either side of him seemed to shift, their surfaces rippling as if they were breathing. He felt a sense of impending doom clawing at the back of his mind. Was it real, or just his imagination playing cruel tricks on him again? The uncertainty made his fear grow, his pulse quickening as he struggled to convince himself it was nothing. He blinked, and they were still again, silent. He swallowed hard, his throat dry, his chest tight. He had to get through the day. He had to act normal. In class, he kept his head down, his eyes on his desk. He could feel the eyes on him, the stares of his classmates, drilling into him. He glanced up, and they were all looking at the teacher, but he knew. He could feel it. The figure was somewhere close, just out of sight, waiting for him to slip. He looked towards the window, and for a second, he saw it, its reflection, standing right behind him, its face close enough that he should have felt its breath. But there was nothing. The minutes dragged on, each one an eternity, the clock ticking too loud, each second echoing in his skull. He looked down at his notes, dark scribbles, lines carved into the paper, deep enough to tear through. His hand was trembling, the pen slipping from his fingers. He tried to focus, to pull himself back, but everything was blurring, the words on the board twisting, forming shapes that shouldn't exist, dark, writhing things that seemed to pulse with life. And then the bell rang, and he moved on autopilot, his body numb, his mind foggy. He pushed through the crowded hallways, everything too loud, the laughter too sharp, the colors too bright. He could see the woods from the window at the end of the hall, the dark line of trees, and he knew it was still there. Waiting. Watching. Its face blurred, featureless, that grin carved into the darkness. He pushed through the doors, out into the open air, breathing deeply, trying to clear his head. He looked towards the woods. The shadows between the trees seemed deeper, darker, and there, at the edge, was the figure. Its head tilted, that grin spreading across its face. He shivered, his stomach twisting. He was out, but it wasn't over. The woods had let him go, but they weren't done with him. Not yet. He started walking, his legs heavy, the laughter of his classmates echoing behind him, distant, wrong. He clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms. He could still feel the pain, the blade slicing into his skin, the blood running warm and thick. He looked towards the school, the bright brick walls, the sun shining overhead, and it all seemed fragile, ready to shatter, to reveal the darkness lurking just beneath the surface. And as he walked, he knew.